So the title of our video this week is The Framework, and that's because in the reading plan, if you've been following, we've looked at the very beginning of the Bible and we've done a couple of verses in between throughout the Old and New Testament, and then we've gone to the very end. And what we're doing by this is trying to set the frame of the whole of the biblical story. And although the Bible isn't necessarily a book like a novel that we might read where there's a clear kind of beginning, middle and end and it all follows each other perfectly, it isn't necessarily in chronological order in the format that we often have it today, for example. But at the same time, what we see from the very first pages of Genesis and the last pages of Revelation is that there is this kind of story of God's interaction with humanity. And if I was going to sum up the message of the Bible into one sentence, are you ready for this? What I would sum it up as is it's the story of creation and new creation. And we get a really clear picture of this idea of creation and new creation when we look at the first pages of Genesis, the creation of the world story, but then also the last pages of the book of Revelation. There is so much in these 5 chapters, if we do Genesis 1, 2 and 3 and then Revelation 21 and 22, that we could probably spend the whole 8 weeks just looking at these. But what we want to do is set a really solid foundation so that everything else that we're going to be looking at over the 7 weeks following this week is going to be in the context of looking at the Bible as a story of creation and new creation. The Bible is trying to tell us something about the world that we all as human beings find ourselves in. What has gone wrong with, for example, the pain and suffering that we see around us, but then how God is going and has through Jesus in some level put it right. So the Bible is making a very bold claim to tell us something about the way that the world is. Now, there are, of course, other ways to read the Bible. That's the beauty of this book. So many people throughout the years have read the Bible in so many different ways. And I'm sure that many of you watching this will have done so many different kinds of Bible studies of tracing certain themes through the biblical narrative. And I'm not saying that any of those things are wrong in any way. And like I said, it's the beauty of these Holy Scriptures that they can speak to us in so many different ways. But the particular theme that we're going to be picking up on for our Story of the Bible series, if you like, is looking at the theme of creation and new creation. And there's so much different language that we can use to describe this, but the idea of God making a world in which he could live in relationship with humans then that plan going wrong pretty quickly on in the biblical story, and then what God is doing through the people that choose to follow him and to bear his image to the rest of the world, how he's going to take them on a journey towards a new creation that he is bringing about, that isn't doing away with the original creation, but in some mysterious, wonderful, magical way is actually fulfilling the original creation that he had in mind all the time. So, we're going to start with Genesis, as I said, this week, and a lot of the ways that people might read Genesis is a little bit like it's a scientific textbook. Now, if you know anything about history, you'll know that science actually hasn't been around for that long when we consider the expanse of time as we've known it as humans, only a few hundred years. Interestingly, though, a lot of the founding fathers of science were actually Christians themselves. And they believed that God had set certain laws in nature that could help us understand the world that we live in more, the world that God had created. And one of the big sticking points for people with the Bible is the seeming, if we read the surface of the text of Genesis, it might seem like it's saying that the world was made in 6 literal days when God kind of zapped things into being one after the other. And so the world is only a certain amount of years old as a result of this. Now, this video is not going to go into the different opinions of what that might be necessarily, but I do want to point out a couple of things. First of all, we need to remember that, as I said a minute ago, science was not science as we know it when the book of Genesis was written, when the text of the creation of the world was written down. And actually, the other thing that we find is there's actually two creation accounts that are given to us in the book of Genesis. There's Genesis 1, which is the traditional account that maybe you're familiar with, of God making the world in these 6 days and on the seventh day resting. But then in Genesis 2, there is actually another creation account where it's a lot more based around Adam and Eve. And suffice to say that there is a multiple array of different ways of interpreting the text in Genesis. And when we take a literal approach to reading the text at face value, sometimes we're actually doing away with the years and years and years and years, the ways that different people have read it over this period of time. And so rather than seeing Genesis as a scientific textbook that is telling us exactly how things happened, I think sometimes it's helpful to see it as a poem or a creative way or a story that is passed down. Jesus told parables, didn't he, to the people? And we don't necessarily think of the story of the prodigal son being history because we know it's a parable. Now, I'm not saying whether Genesis is or isn't true or not, but what I am saying is that something can be true even if historically it didn't happen in exactly the way that something is portrayed. But actually the author of Genesis is trying to show us something theologically. So it's not scientific in that it's trying to tell us dot every I and cross every T of exactly how this world came to be. That is something that thankfully science can help us do. But this is a theological text that is stories that would have been passed down from generation to generation. Because remember, people initially wouldn't have been able to write things down. So everything was communicated through telling tales and telling stories of things. And so the author was bringing together different stories of ancient cosmology and bringing that narrative together in order to tell the story of the God of Israel, God Yahweh, and their account of how they believe Yahweh spoke the word into being. And the way that the author has arranged things, he's done it to tell us a message. So he's not necessarily trying to tell us this is historically exactly how things happened, but he's trying to put these sets of items together in order to give us a picture of the world that God created. And then we move on and we see that the pinnacle of the creation, the one that God says, let us make mankind in our own image, is, as I just said, mankind, Adam and Eve, humankind. Humans are the pinnacle of the creation. And God gives them the opportunity to name the animals, to continue creating with him into the creation that he has made. And it says that God lived with the humans in the garden. There was communion between God and man in Eden, the place where God and man dwelt together. Heaven and earth, there was no separation between them. It was one in the same in that garden experience between God and man. Heaven, remember, is just the place where God dwells. Earth is the place that God created in order to dwell with humans in. The separation only comes in Genesis 3, when this weird creature appears. And we would say today, oh, it's the devil, because of the years of the story of the Bible as it goes on, but also the years of theology of us trying to identify this creature. But at this point in the story, we only know him as the serpent. And the serpent comes and says to Adam and Eve, did God really say that you can't do this and you can't do that? Did God really say that you can eat from the tree of life, but you can't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or you're going to die? Are you really going to die? And so, of course, we know the story. The humans sin and they fall into the trap of the serpent. And the word sin simply means missing the mark. They missed the mark of God's best plan for them, where God wanted them to develop their knowledge of what good and evil was in the context of his plan and purpose. But humans, as we so often do in life, took matters into their own hands and defined good and evil for themselves. And so, because of the choice that humans make, separation has to come between God and man. But what we then see is obviously the biblical narrative continues, which is what we're going to be filling in over the next few weeks. But we get little sprinkles throughout the Bible where the story stops and we get this promise from God. For example, famously in the last pages of Isaiah, where God says, I'm one day in the midst of the pain of Israel, the people group that the Bible focuses in on, the pain of the other nations around, the mistakes that all people, whether they're Jewish or non-Jewish, are making. God says, in the midst of all of this, I'm going to create a new heavens and a new earth one day. And so the story goes on, and the last part of our reading for this week, Revelation 21 and 22, we see that after all of the chaos of Revelation, which we'll get to in the last week of our series, in the midst of the chaos of that, eventually evil is overthrown, death is no more, crying is no more, pain is no more. They're all done away with, thrown into the abyss, and Jesus is the conquering King of the world who brings about a new creation. And we'll get on to Jesus in due course. But this idea on a cosmic scale of what we see is the new Jerusalem, it's called, coming out of heaven down to earth, and heaven and earth are coming together. And so there's a doing away and a dying of the bad things that have been going on, death, pain, sickness, sorrow, all of those things. There's a doing away with those things. But there's also a retaining of God's original plan for creation that is met with heaven, his presence, where God dwells, coming together. And the heading of Revelation 22 in the Bible that I have here, which is the NIV, says this. Let me read it out for you. Eden restored. And it says that the angel who was with John, showing him this kind of vision, says that it showed him a river of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb, down the middle of this great street of the city. And on each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit in every month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be any curse. The throne of God and of the Lamb will be in the city, and his servants will serve him. So we see this picture of this Eden restoration, but then it's described as a city. And so we see the creation of God, the natural world in which we live in, the beautiful natural environment that we live in, coupled with actually something that man has created, cities. And we see this being brought together, and this river going out from that city with the tree of life dotted along the sides of this river, the tree that Adam and Eve had to be exempt from. They couldn't inherit eternal life because they had taken the knowledge of good and evil into their own hands. So that's a little bit of an overview of the story of the Bible that we're looking at today. And let me just close by kind of bringing to land, what does this then mean for us today? Well, sometimes people see the story of the Bible as they start in Genesis and they think, oh, I know what this is about. This is telling us how the world came to be. And so whatever anyone says about it, I know the way that the world came to be. I have this knowledge of good and evil, which sounds to me exactly like what Adam and Eve were supposed to not be doing, that they took matters into their own hands in the first place. Or sometimes we read the end of Revelation and there's so many pictures and it's so hard to understand that we just kind of go with the simple option. And what this is often meant in the church is that we've sometimes misunderstood what Genesis is trying to tell us about our human experience. And so we've also got a bit confused sometimes about what Revelation is trying to tell us about what God is going to do. And so what we've sometimes thought is that the human experience is about trying to believe in God in some abstract way, to have the knowledge of good and evil, so that when we die, we can go to heaven and escape this world in order to be with God. We go as this soul and we kind of float up into the cloud somewhere, and the pearly gates open and we go in and we are before God. But actually what the Bible teaches us is that God's plan is not to do away with his original creation from the story of Genesis, but actually he has placed a mark on you and I as humans made in the Imago Dei, the image of God. And his plan is that we would bear his image on this earth now, that is a picture to the world around us of the way that the way that God intended humans to be. Jesus comes into the picture as the ultimate true human, the God-man, the man who is fully man and yet fully God, and who shows humanity the way to live as a child of God. And then where things are going is that when we die, yes, there is a sense in which we do go to be with God in his dwelling place, which is heaven. But that isn't our ultimate destination. God is going to make it so that heaven and earth eventually come together and join as one. And it's in that relationship with God once again that Eden will be restored. God's original plan of salvation will once again be worked out for you and I. So I hope the video today has made some sense. Sorry that it's a bit of a longer one. If you've managed to make it this far, well done. But these videos, they are going to be a bit more conversational and almost like I'm passing on to you some different thoughts and ways of thinking about things. So as you're reading the reading plan, you can then begin thinking about and kind of trying to wrestle with yourself and come to your own conclusions of some of these things. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again next week for week 2 of our series, The Story of the Bible.
Hey all, thank you very much for watching this YouTube video on the Consecrate YouTube channel. Please like, share the video, subscribe to the Consecrate YouTube channel, and let's spread the good news around the people. We'll see you next week. Bye bye.